get on with the important aspects of today. The first speaker, who helps ground me in an understanding of every nook and cranny of the land that I grew up on, is sacred. And it wasn't just a conceptual idea that the land was sacred, but it was actually, he showed me grinding rocks, village sites, places where, and he started to share with me a few things. I thought, oh my gosh, every corner of this land has been thoughtfully managed. Yes, it has. And so I got to learn about the Coast Miwok and the Southern Pomo landscapes through the next speaker, who is the chairman of sacred sites for the Graton Rancheria, who again supported grounding me in this reality of how this land was managed through his own understanding of it and his experience of it. And I know a fraction, and I've spent this much time out of the amount of time I would like to be learning from Nick. So I was honored today that he agreed to speak and share his experience and knowledge with us. So I'd like to welcome Nick Tipon to the stage. Thank you so much for coming.
So I used to be a teacher in a former life, and so I'm used to wandering around, and I don't like podiums. I feel confined. So I'm going to go through these things pretty quick, and I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. So remember them, and this thing will work. Okay. So as Rebecca mentioned, I'm a member of Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. Also a tribal elder, which means I get, when we have tribal functions, the elders eat first. Part of my favorite thing. But yesterday I was very grateful to the tribe because I was sitting at home and breathing all that wonderful smoke, and got a call from the tribal office that said, would you like an air purifier? I said, sure. I thought, that was nice of them to ask, but then 2 hours later they delivered it, so that was even better. Okay, so first of all, I want to do a traditional welcome to you, let you hear a little bit of the Coast Miwok language. So this is generally done by tribal members. Can they wake up? Can they aniko, opu niko, to wish? So this is a map of our traditional ancestral territory. So we're, down in there. So when we talk about our tribal land, this is what we're talking about. This is what the federal government recognizes. This is what the state government recognizes. This is what most other tribal organizations recognize as our area. So in California, there's lots and lots of tribes. Each has their own idea of what traditional lands we had. But for us, it was Golden Gate Bridge, Russian River, Sonoma-Napa County line, that ridge line, and also Angel Island. So I've done archaeological monitoring on most of the territory, some fascinating stories of what we found and what surprised us. So nowadays, and I talk to a lot of school groups, and one of the things I always tell the teachers and kids is climate change is nothing new. Since the last ice age, things have changed around here quite a bit. So this is where the shoreline was 13,000 years ago. These are the Farallon Islands. So 22 miles out, you could walk to the beach. So a lot of my ancestors lived in the sand dunes out in this area, and they're now underwater. It used to be there was no San Francisco Bay. That was a giant meadow. So a lot of Ohlone people and Coast Miwok people lived out what's now the bay. So that's happened pretty quickly. And this map, you can't read anything, but the gradations are how the sea level gradually rose. So at this point, this shade right here, this was 6,000 years ago. So as you've read, the government's wanting to do some wind farms out off the shore and so forth. Several years ago, the government bureau did a study of all these lands underwater now to see where cultural resources were and how they would be impacted by some of those wind farms. So that's not a done deal. So a lot of tribal people are arguing about it. Okay, so the fundamental to understanding how Native people think and why they act on some things. I just noticed that the XL pipeline has now been delayed again, and Standing Rock and all those things. So sometimes I get asked, why do Native people get so concerned about water and land and so forth? Well, one of the reasons is that our belief system, and the belief system is that everything is connected. Everything has a spirit, and everything is equal. Everything is equal within that system. So to make it simpler to understand for fourth graders when I'm talking to them, I just use the example of Star Wars. Yoda says, and Yoda says, everything, that in the world, everything has a force. And so for Native people, everything has a spirit. So that rock over there, that deer over there, are equal, but also myself as a human, I'm equal to those and they're equal to me. So when everything's equal, you treat things differently. And I'll get into a little bit more about that. But it's important then that when we go out and do things in the environment, that number one, we understand it. Number two, we pay our respects. So before we gather, before we hunt, before we did any of those things, there was always prayers given and thanks given to those who would give of themselves. So I just wanted to mention this in honor of Kat, who I was looking forward to seeing today, but we'll see each other another time. Paleoethnobotany. It's relatively new. What people, scientists do, they go out and they take soil samples, they float them in water. What rises to the top is all the organic stuff, the seeds and pollen and so forth. So they could take and look at what was growing in the soil by the remnants of all that organic stuff. So then they carbon date some of the materials, and from that they can figure out what was growing, when, and where, which is really useful to know how the land's been used over time. So a good example of that is Tole Lake and even Point Reyes National Seashore. One of our tribal members who just got his doctorate in archaeology, now teaching in the Native Studies Department at San Diego State. His study was on the Paleoethnobotany of Tole Lake, and he can tell you what plants were growing 7,000 years ago when people were occupying that valley, and what Native people were eating, which kind of oaks they were eating, what kind of animals they were eating, and various things. So it really adds to our knowledge to know those kinds of things. If you've never been to Tole Lake Regional Park, Sonoma County Park, you should go. It's now open to the public. Spectacular views from the East Ridge. You can see the whole bay. Okay, so some other things that were sacred to Native people were things like view sheds. So at Tole Lake Regional Park, I stood in one spot and took these 4 pictures. So this is Mount Diablo, that's Tamalpais, that's Mount Burdell, and right there is Mount St. Helena. So in our spiritual views, all 4 of these mountains are sacred. Why are they sacred? Because that's where you see the birth of the day. That's where you see the death of the day. Important things to hunter-gatherers when you depended on the environment for your existence. So this is where I'm saying you should take a walk up the hill. It's about a 45-minute walk. It's worth it. So animals were significant, and these are, again, I do a lot of presentations to 4th graders, so they always like these. So, obviously, that's a salmon. And when we think about salmon, 1,000 years ago, every stream was a perennial stream, not a seasonal stream, and they all carried salmon. So salmon were a major part of the diet. Hummingbirds were important in other ways. Tule elks, so nice to see the Tule elk out at Point Reyes again. I keep suggesting to people that they should put them out at Tole Lake Regional Park. But used in many different ways. I have a set of elk antlers. I tell the kids the antlers were used for various things, for tools and other things. No part of any animal was wasted. This is a California condor, which used to be all over this place. In fact, in an archaeological dig recently in Marin County, we found a condor skeleton, intact condor skeleton, that was lived about 1,500 years ago. So we, of course, we're using technology, we CAT scanned it. So someday we may be able to animate it again and recreate it, but they're sacred. But only men could touch condor feathers because condors eat carrion, and so they're associated with the dead. So women who are associated with birth couldn't go anywhere near them. So that was another cultural belief of ours. We use plants in lots and lots of different ways. Shelters, weapons, food, ceremonial uses, and medicinal uses. So our oral histories are full of things about how to use various plants, in what way they need to be processed, when they needed to be collected, and various other things. So, part of full disclosure, I also a member of the STRAW faculty. Anybody know about STRAW? Point Blue Observation. Yeah, anyway. So STRAW is an acronym, stands for Students, Teachers, Restoring a Watershed. So what they do is they go in and they talk to kids about the science of restoration and so forth, and climate change, and then the kids actually go out and do the plantings in the watersheds. So what I do is I go out and talk about the watershed, what used to be there, and so forth. But for that, I created this. This is by interviewing tribal members in literature. These are the 5 kinds of oaks, or 6 kinds, 5 kinds, in our ancestral territory. So not every oak in existence grows here. Some are hard to find now. And then there's a caveat that a tan oak is really not a true oak. They call it it's an evolutionary link between chestnuts and oak trees. So but we still count it as an oak. Then there's a discussion always amongst tribal people, like, which of these oaks is the best to eat? The one that's not really an oak? Yeah, it's continual argument. Some people say, yeah, this is the only one to eat. So at Tole Lake, there was a pumpkin festival recently, and some tribal members were there, and we actually did some acorn mush. We used black oak and tan oak, and most people agree, at least for our tribe, that black oaks were the preferable ones. So anyway, just lots of information. And I wasn't really going to show this because this is out of one of Kat's publications. So, but I told her I was going to show it. So this gives you a sense of how plants were used and how many different uses they had. So valley oak, so the leaves were used to help start fires. The galls were used for their dyes and inks. The burl was used to make bowls and cups. Fungi was used for food and medicine. New sprouts were used for digging sticks and other utensils and tools. Obviously the acorns. Branches were used to help knock the acorns off the tree. The bark was used for tanning and medicines and dyes. And the trunk was used for firewood, for drums, and other things. So it's a good example of how thoroughly and completely we understood our environment and to use every bit in different ways. So here's another plant, one of my favorites because they taste good. Elderberry. So this picture of a blue elderberry, and one of the best desserts I've ever had was actually fresh elderberries and some vanilla ice cream. And it was just absolutely delightful, and even what made it really special was that actually Kat picked the elderberries that afternoon, and then we shared them. So elderberries or elderberry bushes, trees, whatever, they're also interesting. Obviously the berries are edible, but the wood is really interesting because in our belief system we believe that the elderberry trees store songs. So if you're going to make a clapper stick, which is used to call the spirits, get the attention of the spirits, you only use elderberry. If you're going to make a flute, only elderberry. And what's interesting is Kat happened to go to her ancestral territory a year or so ago and went to Scotland, and she found out that when they make bagpipes, they only use elderberry. So half a world away, indigenous people knew that that's the plant where the songs stay. And there's other examples of things like that. So, as a Native person, there's been major cultural and environmental impacts to our culture. The two biggest are colonialism and climate change. So in this area, colonialism means missions, the California mission system. So there's actually, people say there were 21 Franciscan missions, not true. There were 20 Franciscan missions. Mission Sonoma was a Mexican mission. There were other parts of the mission system, the presidios. There were 3, San Diego, Monterey, and San Francisco. And then the 21 missions, but then the missions all had ostensias, farms, like Mission San Rafael had one in Santa Rosa. So they had a huge impact on the land. And then what often people forget in this area is that the Russians were here. So the Russians, not the Russian government, the Russian RAC, Russian America Company. So they were hunting sea lions and seals around here. So they had it out, the biggest outpost was at Fort Ross, and they also had one in Bodega Bay, right next to where they were going to build a nuclear power plant. So there was lots of other people. Drake was here, he claimed this land for England. Cermeño was here, he claimed the land for Portugal. So lots of other foreign influences on our territory. There's a lot of discussion about what colonialism is. But looking at it from a Native point of view, from the original inhabitants, from the first Americans, you have to look at the mission system and what their goals were. Their first goal was to seize and then protect their land. They needed to send valuable resource to their home countries. That's the whole reason of the colonial powers, go out and grab resources. To support local military presidios and land claims, to convert and save the Indians. And all of this stuff was permission given by the doctrine of discovery. And Rebecca and I've had some conversations recently about that. But the doctrine of discovery, how many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Okay, that's pretty good. So basically in medieval times, the governments got together, decided to try and rationalize and give permission to themselves to go out and take resources from other countries, from indigenous people all over the world, and it gave them the right to do whatever they wanted. So, because in their words, indigenous people, Native people were less than human, because they weren't white, they didn't believe in God, their God. So that's the doctrine of discovery. The impact of the mission system to the tribe in this area. In the 1852 census, there were only 14 full-blooded Coast Miwok people left alive. And that's from a population that was estimated between 8,000 and 10,000 people in this area. How did they die? Disease is a big thing. Forced to eat different foods and weakened their systems so even the flu could kill them. There were bounties put out on Native people in California by the governor. So lots of things were happening. When you get your freedom, your land, your language, your culture, all taken from you, big changes in your life, and it's hard to understand how traumatic that was when you have a whole belief system, and your kids are taken away from you, put into reservation schools and so forth. And then we were forced to do labor at the missions. And that wasn't just like, okay, go out and work that thing for 6 hours. You were expected to be out there working all day long with very little rest, in poor conditions, and very little food. So a lot of people just died from being overworked. But when you start looking at the emissions and their impact on California, the biggest thing I think is the environmental damage the emissions did. And there's been very few studies about how that impacted the native people. So the mission system brought in, first of all, cattle, which totally changed the range. There's a Native American plant that was used like lettuce called Shoyandian clover. And one of Kat's graduate students did a study on it, and because they thought that it was extinct, but they found some over by Bodega Bay, and she tried to propagate it. And what she found out was that there was a certain kind of slug that was a non-native slug that was brought over by the missionaries that loved that plant and would just eat it no matter what they did. So we think about cattle, we think about other things the missionaries did, but lots of subtle things, subtle plants when they imported things, totally destroyed California's system. So recently I was asked to give a speech at the California Adaptation Forum. Any of you go to that? In Sacramento, and basically the governor's office holds these forums. This year's was the third. They hold them every other year to bring people up to date on the current science of climate change. So it's intended for cities and counties and agencies to hear what's going on so they can better plan for mitigation and or adaptation. So this year, one of the big emphasis at the conference was including tribal agencies in this, because they finally realized that some of the things that tribal people have been talking about in terms of managing or co-managing the environment had been neglected as not science. So that changed this year. And so now if you go online and do the California Adaptation Forum, there's two documents. There's an executive summary, and there's also a 56-page thing on how to use traditional environmental knowledge and incorporate that into the science of climate change. So in the executive summary, it talks about some pretty specific things. Number one, that a recognition that tribes are actively managing climate change and their environment, that the tribes are taking action to reverse the causes of climate change and their natural resources, that tribes are combining ancient history and generational and place-based knowledge. Place-based knowledge, so it's not the same for everybody. Every tribe has a different environment, every tribe has different traditions, so it's unique to every tribal area, which, and if you're going to change the way we messed up the environment, it needs to be very, very site-specific. Tribal knowledge focuses on ecosystem interconnectivity and also respects the carrying capacity of the land. That tribes are utilizing techniques to mitigate and adapt to climate impacts. And the reason this is important, like I said, that for a long time they just dismissed native knowledge as not scientific. So there's a big turnaround now. So sharing some of the traditional environmental knowledge, some of us look at that as, we have some concerns. Number one, every tribe is very, very different. We have our own identity, our own beliefs. So sharing those is not something we're used to doing. It's part of our religion. There's some things we don't talk about. There's some things that you can't talk about to other people, even other tribes. Some tribes consider it to be a form of theft or appropriating our knowledge. And then there's the extracting, and I know we're going to have presentations later about fire, so extracting piecemeal parts of things. So the example of fire. So I went to a thing in Sonoma recently, and one of the state fire marshals was there for CAL FIRE, And they were, basically the theme of the evening was, well, if we had done Native American burning to reduce the fuel load, there would be, the fire's impacts would be lessened. But that's not Native American burning. Native American burning is many things, many, many things. Interrupting the life cycle of a larva that gets into the acorns. It's a big one. Clearing the underbrush. All of those things are really important culturally. But reducing the fuel load is just one of those. So people have to be very careful when they talk about tribes without talking to the tribe. And that's really the big emphasis nowadays for all tribes is people need to be talking to us and not talking about us. So one of the other things that's happening from climate change is we're losing a lot of our cultural resources. So Point Reyes National Seashore several years ago did a study on all the old village sites and Native American cultural resources in the park lands. And not surprisingly, many of them are being destroyed by climate change, by rising water levels, by fire, by disease, various other things. So some people went out and did a study of the sites to look at their current condition so they could be monitored over time. But I always think, you know, for us, we're losing village sites, we're losing burial sites, we're losing other sites that are important to us. So how would most people feel if the Golden Gate Bridge or the Statue of Liberty were destroyed by climate change? What can you do about it? Or do you just let them go away? Federal law says that because they're culturally significant, they should be protected. But who can afford that anymore? You know, you build a dam around the Statue of Liberty so it's not destroyed by sea level rise? By building the dam, do you change its cultural meaning? So there's lots of issues, lots of questions for Native people. When you look at, later on you're going to hear more about basket weaving, when the things that you need to have to make baskets, when they disappear, do you protect those? Do you try to replant them somewhere else, which for our tribe, we shouldn't do. We only use things from our traditional ancestral territory. They only work if they're from our territory. So, like, because I dealt with a lot of burials and things, I always carried smudge with me and had to be careful that the source of the smudge was genetically from our ancestral territory. So it's not simple, it's costly, it's complicated, it's expensive, but we're going to have to do all of that stuff. So the title of this was, We Have No Word for Wilderness. So in the Coast Miwok language, we have no word that says wilderness. The environment was our home, it was our, we understood it, and if we didn't survive. So we never have had or will have a word that says wilderness. It's home. Any questions? No questions? We'll be around for a while, so if you think of some, feel free to come up. And
There's one more.
yes?
It's more of a technical question that I've been wondering for a while. You introduced yourself as Indian, and I'm wondering, like,
Is that okay?
Yeah.
In my speech to fourth graders, the first slide is a picture of a Plains Indian with eagle feathers and leathers and carrying a bow and arrow, and a picture of me. And I asked the kids, I said, who's the Indian? I said, they always say the guy with feathers. And, you know, I said, that's the Hollywood Indian. And in answer to your question, it goes back to what my mother one of the things my mother used to tell me is, you know, it doesn't matter what you're called, it's how it's said. So you can call me Indian, Native American. Every tribe feels a little bit differently, but most Native people figure, okay, just say it respectfully, The one thing that does bug Native people though, is the term redskins. Anybody know where that came from? When you got scalped, your skull bleeds, your face turns red, so you're the redskin. So, you know, some sports organizations still like to call themselves that, but for Native people, it has a whole different meaning. So like I said, I'll be around, oh yeah, one quick.
Well, I'd like to ask how, I was really interested in your, that finding from the state or that update on climate change and how we, in some cities, we're doing our general plans, we're planning for sea level rise and cultivating climate change. How can we get our electeds to start paying attention to some of these resources that we need to include in planning and honoring these cultural sites? Well,
You expect me to have an answer to that? Well, the whole climate adoption forum was for those people.
Yeah.
And I even looked at one computer program that walked you through the steps. Like if you want to focus on this particular aspect of climate change, here's the things you need to do as an elected official.
Okay.
So it's kind of like climate change for dummies. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.